Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another Wednesday night Bible study with the Nicholasville Church of Christ as we continue our series, Theological Themes in the Old Testament. So last week we talked about God's covenant with Abraham, and prior to Abraham, we studied God recreating the world through the flood and setting up a new covenant with humanity. And God's covenant with Abraham was the first step in redeeming that humanity. And we read of the promise that God will make a nation from Abraham, that they will dwell in the land of Canaan, and that through Abraham's offspring, all nations will be blessed. Well, tonight we see Abraham's offspring in a truly dark place. God redeems these people and establishes a covenant with them by which he makes them into a formal nation. And the figure through whom he accomplishes these things is Moses. So we'll look into God's redemption of the children of Israel tonight in the Exodus. This is the foundational event in the history of Israel for their identity and their self-understanding. And this is also the central redemptive event in the story of redemption of the Old Testament. So it is definitely worth spending our time in. So as you probably know, if you've read much of the Old Testament in the fairly recent past, there is quite a bit of time between Abraham and Moses. And so to jump from one figure to the next is to jump over some major biblical figures and events. And this is something that I'll keep saying in the future in this class, but this class is not meant to cover everything in the Old Testament. What we're trying to do is trace the central story of the Old Testament so we can better appreciate the Old Testament as a whole. But to catch us up to speed for tonight, Abraham and Sarah give birth to Isaac, and then Isaac and Rebekah give birth to Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob, through Rachel and Leah, has 12 sons and one daughter, and from these 12 sons, Abraham's descendants will grow into the nation of Israel. And Jacob is renamed Israel after an intense encounter with God, and so that's where the name Israel comes from. And the relationships between all of these figures is often dramatic, with lots of intense things happening. And so it makes for some very good reading in the book of Genesis. And Jacob's 12 sons, they will have drama that will lead 11 of the brothers to cast out the 12th brother, Joseph, and sell him into slavery. And then Joseph, over time, will rise through the ranks to go from a slave to the most powerful man in Egypt, apart from Pharaoh himself. And then when famine strikes, Jacob's family will move to Egypt, where they are received well thanks to Joseph. And there in Egypt, the children of Israel grow into a large multitude. And then they are enslaved and they are oppressed as slaves for generations. And so remember our two primary options for the date of the Exodus, the mid-1400s or the mid-1200s BC. It's helpful to remind ourselves of that just to know roughly where we are on the timeline when we talk about the Exodus. So God bringing the Israelites out of slavery and ultimately into the land promised to Abraham, this is the primary act of redemption in the Old Testament and the foundational event for the nation of Israel. And notice what God instructs Moses to say to the Israelites at the beginning of this Exodus event in Exodus 6, verses 6 through 8. Say therefore to the people of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from slavery to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you for possession. I am the Lord. And also I'd like us to look at Exodus 15, verses 11 through 13. This is part of the Song of Moses. This actually occurs after the Exodus event, and this song is reflecting back on the Exodus. In Exodus 15, it says, Who was like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who was like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. You have led in your steadfast love the people whom you have redeemed. So the Israelites thought on, they looked back on the Exodus and they thought of the Exodus as an act of God redeeming them. And again, Moses is the man God will work through to make these things happen. Moses is ideally situated for this calling. He was born a Hebrew, but he was raised in Pharaoh's court. And then he flees to the distant land of Midian when it is discovered that he killed an Egyptian man while trying to rescue a Hebrew slave. And right before God calls Moses in the famous burning bush moment, we're given reasons why God is concerned to redeem Israel out of slavery. This is Exodus 2, verses 23 through 25. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So God redeems Israel in the Exodus out of faithfulness to his covenant with Abraham. If you remember from last week, we talked about when God passed through the bloodied halves of the animal sacrifices, and that was a serious expression of serious commitment on God's part. He redeems Israel from slavery here to follow through on that commitment. God acted on this covenant also because of the cry of the Israelites. God will give this reason to Moses in the burning bush moment as well. God is acting out of compassion for the children of Israel. Their suffering moves him to action. And then the third reason God redeems Israel is not given here in the burning bush moment, but we will see it come up next week. And that is, God has a mission for Israel. He needs them out of slavery to accomplish that mission. So God redeems Israel from slavery out of faithfulness to his covenant with Abraham, out of compassion for their suffering, and because he has a mission and a purpose for them. So in Exodus chapter 7 through 12, we read of the famous 10 plagues that the Lord brings upon Egypt because Moses stands before Pharaoh and tells him that he should let God's people go. And Pharaoh refuses, and each time God responds with a plague upon Egypt. And you can see the plagues here on the screen. We won't dwell too much on them for tonight, but they can be categorized into groups of 3, with the 10th plague standing apart from the rest as the last and the most devastating. This is the plague that finally prompts Pharaoh to let Israel go. But even then, it's not long before he changes his mind again and pursues the Israelites. So plagues 1 through 3 concern Egypt's water. Plagues 4 through 6 concern the people and beasts of Egypt and concerns the land. And then plagues 7 through 9 are all airborne plagues and plagues that affect the air, hail and locusts and thick darkness. And then the 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. Perhaps you have heard before of attempts to explain the plagues as natural catastrophes that happened in Egypt. And the idea is not, at least not always, that God did not act through the plagues, but rather that he acted in a natural way instead of supernatural. He worked through natural disasters to afflict Egypt. Maybe you've heard those kind of ways of trying to account for the plagues before. I have no problem with these types of explanations, provided they fit with what the scriptures actually say happened during the plagues. But that is where some of these explanations run into trouble. In Exodus 7, when we read of the water turning to blood, it's not only the Nile River and the canals and the ponds, but even the water in their cups and other vessels. That is hard for an entirely natural explanation to account for. And then, of course, the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, that can have no purely natural explanation. Only a supernatural explanation works. But still, I don't think we have to choose in such an either-or fashion between natural and supernatural events here. The two were not so neatly separated in ancient thinking, and there is no reason why God could not have used both natural and supernatural disasters to afflict Egypt. Perhaps you've also heard that the plagues were intended to correspond to the gods of Egypt and show how Israel's God is more powerful than each one of them. The Lord mentions the Egyptian gods in relation to the 10th and final plague. The Nile turning to blood and flooding, that works against the gods associated with the Nile. And then just the general devastation of the plagues, that works against the prosperity that the Egyptian gods were supposed to bring to the Egyptians. And so even though there is not a one-to-one correspondence for the 10 plagues to each specific god, it is hard to imagine that the Egyptians and Pharaoh could witness and experience these events without making the connection that the God of Israel is supreme over the gods of Egypt. It's interesting to note that the narrative of the plagues in Exodus 7 through 12 barely references the Egyptian gods, other than the one time that we already mentioned. The focus is strictly on God and his power. Perhaps it's as though the Egyptian gods aren't even important enough to be worth mentioning in the narrative. But clearly, this is the focus that the Israelites were supposed to have on this event and their descendants as they read back on this event. The focus for them was entirely on the Lord. Instead of focusing on the plagues, I want to briefly focus on Pharaoh himself. He is the chief adversary of the Exodus. This is what we read in Exodus 3, verses 19 and 20. This is God speaking to Moses, and he says, "But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go." And we read repeatedly throughout this section that Pharaoh's hard heart is the problem. It is the reason why he will not let Israel go. And God is aware of this from the very beginning, as we just read God speaking to Moses. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart is described in different ways in Exodus. It's mentioned 19 total times in the Exodus event. Sometimes Pharaoh simply hardens his heart. He refuses to let Israel go. Sometimes the Lord hardens his heart. And sometimes we simply read that Pharaoh's heart was hardened without any explicit reference to God or Pharaoh doing the hardening. And so this leads to the question, who was really responsible for Pharaoh's hard heart? And different interpreters will answer this in slightly different ways. But I think it's safe to say that the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was a joint effort. Pharaoh was obstinate and refused to let the children of Israel go. God knew he would respond this way, but God persisted in showing his power anyway to Pharaoh, which only made Pharaoh more obstinate. And God knew this would be Pharaoh's reaction each time, but he continued showing his power to make it clear to everyone who was really in charge. This is what we read in Exodus 9 and verse 16. It says, "But for this purpose I have raised you up," speaking to Pharaoh, "to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." This is the purpose Pharaoh's hard heart serves, to show that the Lord is in charge here, not Pharaoh. I think with Pharaoh we get a great example of how God accomplishes his will on earth, specifically his will related to his people, regardless of whether someone is compliant with God or opposing him. God's power will be made clear either way, and God can use someone to accomplish his purposes even if that person is attempting to stand in God's way. Pharaoh ultimately pays for his hardness of heart at the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, we can also call it. God parts the waters for the Israelites, but then when Pharaoh sends in his forces to pursue, they perish in the water. A couple of weeks ago, we discussed the significance of God delivering through water while we were discussing the flood. God once again displays his power here by controlling the waters of the sea. So the Exodus is the single most important redemptive event in all Israelite history. It's very similar to the way that we talk as Christians of the cross and the resurrection as the foundational event that gives meaning to everything else we do as Christians. In the Exodus, God displays his power over Israel's oppressors in mighty ways, and he also displays his power by parting the waters of the Red Sea. And it is clear that it is God who delivers Israel, not Moses, and certainly not the strength of the Israelites themselves. It is certainly God who has delivered Israel. And this basic observation, this is going to become very important for next week's class. So next week, we're going to take a look at the law of Moses. I'm really excited to do this. This is the part of the Bible where many read the Bible in a year plans, where many people undergoing those plans begin to fall short. This is where a lot of people stumble and often give up in the law of Moses. But I hope that we will see that the law of Moses is much more than just that hard part of the Bible that we can avoid because it doesn't really apply to Christians anyway. That is sometimes how the law of Moses is described. But it has great significance for the story of the Old Testament, and it has actually still great significance for today, even if it's not the law that we consider ourselves to be under before God. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that next week. But thank you for joining us tonight as we've thought about the Exodus, the central redemptive event in the Old Testament. Thank you for joining us. Hope you all are doing well. Take care and have a great rest of the week.